podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam. This is All Across America. Robert Moor, welcome to All Across America.
Hey, Mark. Thanks so much for having me.
So what I love about you and your writing, you've written 2 books on trails in trees, is that it's true participatory journalists. You're not writing about other people doing stuff. You're the one doing the stuff, which I really admire. And you're doing some pretty aerial acrobatic type stuff. You're up hundreds of feet in giant sequoias and tree sits. Did you ever have fear of heights?
You know, it's funny. When I was a kid, I didn't have much of a fear, not an unusual fear. I do remember being pretty afraid of the high dive when I was, about 5 or 6 years old at the local swimming pool.
Fair enough.
But then you jump off that once and you get over it, right? And that's the kind of the remarkable thing to me about a fear of heights is that it's one of those great life lessons you get as a kid, which is you do what scares you and you realize it's not that scary. And so, when I was a kid, I was climbing trees all the time. And that always felt very comfortable up there. As a teenager, I went bungee jumping and skydiving and did all of that stuff. And, I'm a rock climber. So no, I don't really have a fear of heights, not an unusual fear of heights, at least. But then I did have an incident, which I recount in the book, where I tried to climb a tree as an adult. I was in my mid-30s, I think, at the time. And for some reason, this fear of heights just gripped me. I was only maybe, 10 or 15 feet off the ground. It wasn't anything particularly wild, but it just grabbed hold of me. And I thought, where did this come from? I didn't notice having a fear of heights before that, but I think it was really something bigger than a fear of heights. I think it was a kind of cautiousness. It was a kind of pathological cautiousness that tends to take over as we get older. And it's like a fear of doing new things, doing risky things, doing things that we would have done without a second thought when we were younger. But suddenly, you're 40 and it just starts to creep in.
Yeah, your brain is fully developed as it wasn't when it was 17.
Yeah, I think in some ways maybe it's overdeveloped. Your sort of prefrontal cortex becomes overdeveloped. And also I think, as I describe in the book, when you're a kid, your brain is really branchy. You have all of these excess neural connections. And I think that does make it easier to try new things and try things that maybe don't have a lot of utility. They're not going to make you money or, make you more attractive to your mate or something. They're just things you do. You just do them. You're just trying stuff all the time when you're a kid. And I think that's one of the things that it really starts to fade as we get older. And you can actually see it on a neural level. We're actually pruning away those connections. So it just gets harder and harder to try something new. And I think that's something that's really important for us to try to hold on to is that branching. I'm often saying, got to stay branchy.
And so you use a lot of new words for me that I loved. One of which was, I think, talking about a little bit about what you had just covered, which is, what is treeification? How does that apply to humans?
Yeah, there's all sorts of words like that in this book. Arborescence, treeification.
Yes, love it.
I think, I say I don't want to anthropomorphize trees. I want to arborize humanity. I think that what I'm trying to do is to take trees, and this is something, I didn't originate this. This is actually the philosophers Deleuze and Guattari coined this term arborescence, but they did it in sort of a negative way, and I'm trying to do it in a positive way, which is to look at trees as a kind of cosmic or philosophical structure, something that is a way of being in this world that's, branching out in all directions, but it's pruning back what doesn't work, right? It's not just sort of like this big amorphous cloud that has no rigor to it. And then it gnarls around what works, and most importantly, it sends down deep roots in local ecologies. So when you put all those things together, the branchiness, the rigor, the gnarling, which is a sort of resilience, and then the rootedness, I think you get a really profound way of being in this world. And it's what allows trees to persist for so long, to be some of the oldest living things on Earth, and also some of the largest.
And the other thing that you mentioned about trees, which is so fascinating about flora in general, is that they don't move. They're stationary. And, imagine humans. How would humans survive if we were immobile? Whereas trees are stuck, and they've evolved to these magnificent creatures by never moving.
Yeah, they've been forced to develop this way of being precisely because they're stuck in place. Animals, I can't think of any. There's a couple of sessile animals, but almost all animals, we roam around. And so if something happens that's, not ideal, we can just run away. We can flee from pests. We can flee from predators. We can hide from storms. Trees can't do any of that. They have to stay where they are and try to adapt to the conditions. And that shape of a tree, that is really what that is what it's doing. It's adapting. The one of the things that bonsai artists told me is that young trees are really boring to bonsai artists because nothing's happened to them yet, right? They haven't been through all those storms and snowfalls and all those things that bend the branches and twist the trunk and tear pieces off of it. It has to heal around all those wounds. That's what gives a tree character. And that is really what a tree is. It's this long, slow act of surviving and adapting to the local conditions and in the end sort of flourishing, right, in those conditions.
And a bonsai tree, I mean, it's interesting in a way. Obviously, it's a miniature tree, but it also is so heavily reliant on human hands. But they're human hands that maybe have a different relationship to trees, and that you almost paint the picture of these bonsai artists. Well, maybe they paint the picture themselves as being almost servants to these trees.
Yeah, there's all sorts of paradoxes in bonsai that I love. I mean, the first just being, of course, that one of the defining features of a tree is that it's large, and yet a bonsai is tiny. By definition, it is, kept tiny by restricting the root base. The other paradox, or another paradox, is that I think to most of us, when we first see a bonsai, it seems kind of cruel. It almost seems like a metaphor for humanity's like
Right.
quote unquote mastery of the earth. It's like I'm going to take this thing, and back in the 1800s when Westerners were first encountering bonsai, they would compare it to foot binding. That it was
Right.
this kind of this crippling, and they found it really ugly, both like physically and metaphorically, philosophically. But I think that when you talk to bonsai artists, what they say is it's an act of caretaking. It's an act
Yeah.
of working with that tree to keep it alive in this highly artistic form over the course of centuries. In some cases, I mean, I saw a 1,000-year-old bonsai tree in
Right.
Japan. So it is remarkable when you think of it in that way that they managed to keep them alive for so long and dedicate their lives to them. I mean, these bonsai artists, their whole life is bonsai. They
Yeah.
can't take a day off really, or
Right.
their trees are at risk of dying because they're raising so many of them, and so many of them are so delicate. So there's a lot in there about our relationship to nature and how we can sort of artificially construct nature, or how there's this in-between space, this interesting in-between space between the natural and the unnatural that I find really philosophically fascinating.
And the bonsai artist, you had an opportunity to sit down with, I guess, what is considered the top bonsai master in the world.
Yeah, I mean, some people might contest that. I've spoken to some who don't like his style, but I think he is unquestionably within the world of Japanese bonsai, which is very hierarchical. Yeah, I think he's the considered the top artist, the top earning artist, and the one with the most radical reputation, the one who really radically transformed the art form. That some people call him the Picasso of bonsai, because he was the first one to sort of really break the art form apart and put it back together again. He started asking himself why people don't use power tools to work on these trees. At the time it was very traditional art form, and he realized that by creating these power tools with an apprentice of his, they could do these radical transformations. They could take really young trees and make them look really old. He would flip them upside down and turn the branches into the roots and the roots into the branches. He did all these really wild things. And at first, the bonsai community hated it. All the traditionalists just were up in arms about what he was doing. They called it noisy bonsai, or some people said he was making sculptures, not trees. And then eventually he won them over just because his creations were so beautiful that it was undeniable that what he was doing was truly a work of art.
And in that section, you wrote about the irony of creating a book made from trees. And you had interviewed Julia Butterfly Hill, which maybe we can get to later, who
Yeah.
have requested that the book be made from 30% post-consumer
Yeah.
recycled content. What is your take on that? Because I think it gets back all the way to the end of the book and the philosophy behind the understanding of, yes, trees can be repurposed, and yes, trees do need to be cut down, but there needs to be a reasoning behind it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. I think anyone who's written a book about trees fairly early on has to grapple with the irony of the fact that trees are gonna die in order to make a book. And that is something, in a larger way, I mean, we can have that conversation. I think it's an interesting conversation to be had about how we have to live within the confines of the world as it currently is in order to change it, right? And that this is true of whether you're, driving a car to go to a climate change protest, or flying on an airplane. There are all these ways in which we are sort of eco hypocrites. And the
Yeah.
reason for that is because the world is constructed as it is, and we have to work within that. Otherwise, we couldn't do anything really. You couldn't publish any books or achieve what you want to achieve in order to try to change the world, hopefully, and make it so that in the future it's not this way. And this is one of the reasons why I love Julia Butterfly Hill is that she's always pushing against the world as it is and pushing other people to try to hold true to their values. And so, as you say, she I reached out to her and she wrote back and she said, it really doesn't make sense for me to talk to someone about my love of trees if the book is going to be printed on dead trees. So if you can get your publisher to agree to publish the book on more than 30% recycled paper content, I'll talk to you. And it took me 2 years to get my publisher to agree to that, of emails
Wow.
back and forth and back and forth. And they kept saying to me, look, it's not as easy as it was. When Julia published her book, The Legacy of Luna, there were a lot more printers out there and there was a lot more recycled paper. It was a lot easier to
Oh,
do. Now there are a lot fewer. The whole industry is sort of contracting. And so it becomes a lot more expensive and a lot more difficult to do that. And I kept saying to them, yes, but I need this interview in order to finish my book. So you have to agree to it. And it was this kind of back and forth, that
yeah.
eventually resulted in them agreeing to it. I got the signed contract and I wrote to Julia and said, oh, here you go. And she's like, all right, now
There
you
you
can come
go.
talk to me. So she was
Good.
the sort of the fulcrum that was necessary to get that done. And I think people like that, this stubborn people who hold true to their values are really valuable in this world because it allows us to push back against the system as it is. And otherwise, we just sort of follow the path of least resistance.
Yeah. And in terms of tree sitters, if there were to be a famous tree sitter, Julia Butterfly Hill would be it. Can you
She would,
describe a
yeah.
little about what she is and what she's like today?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, she's the rock star of tree sitters. If anyone even knows what tree sitting is, who's listening to this, they
Yeah.
probably know about it because of Julia Butterfly Hill. She's a young woman who climbed up into the branches of a coast redwood and that was named Luna. That was, this ancient tree that was going to be cut down. And I think she thought she was going to be up there for like 5 days initially. And she thought, well, that sounds like a long time, but all right. They built this platform in the branches of the tree and someone else was living up there and they needed someone to swap out. So she climbed up there and ended up spending 2 years at living in the top of that tree, surviving, all kinds of storms and, helicopters buzzing her tree and them trying to starve her out and just incredible challenges. And in the process became this environmental icon. And so when she came down from the tree, she went up there, in a complete unknown and came down as sort of a public hero, an environmental
Right.
hero. She managed to save that tree and a swath of trees around it. And then she embarked on a years-long publicity campaign, not just for old growth forests, but for environmental causes and social causes in general. And she was in high demand. And I think it took a lot out of her. I think that the world, when you become that famous that fast, everyone wants something from you. And I think that
Yeah.
was really exhausting for her, but then it became much worse because she was involved in second car accident that was
Oof.
pretty terrible, and she has this degenerative disease, and so life has been really quite hard for her since she came down out of Luna, and so in that ways, it was hard for me to see her, going through all those challenges, this just beautiful spirit. I mean, anyone who's
Yeah.
seen the photos of her in that tree knows she's just incredibly beautiful, fierce person, and she still has that quality. She's still that beautiful, fierce woman. She's just dealing with all of these challenges, and so I was really, yeah, honored to get to talk with her and to see her outlook on life. It's a lot more gnarled now than it was before. She's faced a lot
Sure
of pain
was.
and a lot of challenges.
Yeah.
And through it all, she has this beautiful outlook. She says, I don't like talking about hope because, if people say there's no hope, then they just don't get off their butt and do anything. And if they think there is hope, they don't get off their butt and do anything. So she says, hope is what we create in this moment. The question is, are we creating hope or not? That's the only thing that matters.
I mean, I think hope is extremely important. It's something to look forward to, but yes, you don't want an absence of hope. and, I,
Yep.
and I hope her life hasn't taken that away from her, but it was great to see her all these years later. And she certainly has changed, but it sounds like her spirit, her personality has not.
Exactly. Yeah.
You also, I mean, you've traveled to, and it sounds, I was going to ask a question, but I already know the answer to this. And do you have a bonsai tree? And it sounds like from all your, traveling that you do, pretty impossible for you to have a bonsai tree at all.
Yeah, I do. It's right on the other side of that boulder back there. You could see it. So that bonsai I bought, it's a Japanese dwarf juniper. I bought it from a bonsai garden right near here. That's how I got interested in bonsai in the first place, was visiting this little garden. And yeah, it was struggling. I mean, I would go away for periods of time and come back, ask my neighbors to water it. And, we had a number of heat waves here in British Columbia as we're having all over. And it's really tough for a little bonsai to survive that. And so it was just getting ragged. It was really looking bad. And I describe it in the book as a former show poodle gone feral. Just all of its
Yes.
bark was peeling and its needles were dropping away. And what happens with bonsai is when they enter that sort of downward spiral, it's really hard to pull them out because the foliage is what gets it food, right? It's gathering food through photosynthesis, and so when it starts losing those needles, it's losing the energy it would need to push out new needles and get more energy, and so it just circles the drain. And I wrote to my bonsai master, my teacher, Gerald. I said, what should I do? And he said, just plant it in the ground. The amazing thing about a bonsai is you can plant it back in the ground, and they will often recover, and not only that, eventually they will shoot back up into a full-size tree. I mean, so even a
Wow.
bonsai that's been in a pot for hundreds of years, if you put it in the ground and you allow its root base to expand, it will expand too. So it's only ever sort of temporarily dwarfed. If it has the right conditions, it will just transform back into a normal-sized tree. Of course, my little bonsai will not, because it's dwarf juniper. It's really like kind of a shrub, and so it will stay small
Gotcha.
forever. But it's doing well. I just looked at it this morning.
So, what's the difference between a shrub and a tree? You touched on that in the book a little bit.
Yeah, so it's really just has to do with size. I mean, it has to do with there are woody shrubs, right? So the idea, the best, easiest definition of a tree is it's just a big plant with a stick up the middle. That's what Colin
Mm,
Tudge calls it. Which the stick up the middle, meaning that it has wood, it has lignin, and that's what allows it to grow tall. So this is something that plants have evolved over and over again throughout evolutionary history. Is the tree growth form. That's a term that biologists use. It's a growth form. It's a way of growing, which is to develop woody tissues and develop branches. And then you sort of allow the tree shoots up out of the ground. It can get much taller than other plants. And that lignin also makes the wood really hard. So it's very resilient. And so the bonsai, the shrub is a sort of a magic trick. It looks like a tree, but it's not, because it doesn't have enough lignin to grow tall. It will always sort of, the branches
I
eventually,
see.
once it gets tall enough, it'll start to bend over again, and it'll actually, it's called Juniper's procumbens, which means lying face down. It'll just lie face down on the ground.
And sequoias, what about them made them grow so tall? I mean, obviously
Yeah.
they're just an outlier. Trees are is special, and sequoias are something else.
Yeah, so sequoias are the largest. The coast redwoods, which are their cousins, are the tallest on Earth. The sequoias are the largest by mass, but they're both just enormous. I mean,
Yeah.
however, whichever way you look at it, they're enormous. And the question of how the sequoias get both so large and so old. They can also live, I think, more than 3,000 years.
Oh,
Really has to do with how well defended they are. They have just incredible resilience built into them from all kinds of, so trees don't really die from old age. This is what we currently think, is that they don't senesce in the same way that human beings do. As our genetic code reproduces itself, it starts to degrade, and that's sort of what
right.
causes aging. Theirs, for whatever reason, doesn't, or at least it doesn't on a short enough time span that we can see that. What kills trees are pests, storms, droughts, those kinds of things. And sequoias are just incredibly well armored against all of those things. They have this incredibly thick bark that has an asbestos-like quality, so it repels fire. They're very
Wow.
rich in tannins, so they are able to fight off pests. And the other thing that's amazing about trees of all kinds, but especially trees like sequoias, is the bigger they get, in a sense, the stronger they get, because as every year a tree is growing outward, one layer of tissue at a time. And that tissue, as it dries out, it becomes the hardwood. So that cambial tissue is sort of, as I say in the book, sort of like the skin becomes the skeleton over time.
Right.
And so as it gets bigger, that trunk is getting stronger and stronger, unless it sort of rots out from the inside, which happens sometimes. But you've just got this stronger core to the tree, which allows it to, again, resist storms and all the things that would kill a big tree. And so what we are seeing now is there is a unique combination of threats to sequoias thanks to
Yeah.
climate change, which is these pest outbreaks are combining with droughts, which are combining with larger and larger fires. And those actually are starting to kill off some of the giant sequoias that would have previously been immune to them, which is a scary thing. But they're still holding up pretty well
Yeah.
compared to a lot of the big trees worldwide, which are under greater threat.
But you've said that they can withstand the droughts, they can withstand fire, they could withstand, beetles, but they can't withstand the triple threat of all of them at
Yeah.
once.
That's the work of a biologist named Anthony Ambrose, and he that's what he's finding is that when you combine those factors, suddenly the trees just can't fend it off because one of the ways that trees fend off pests, for example, is by using the liquids, right? Creating this resin which can repel them. Well, if you don't have enough resin, if you don't have enough water to start to flush out those insects and fight them off,
Right.
then the insects start boring through the tissues, you start getting infections there.
Yeah.
Also, the water column, if you don't have enough water coming up from the roots, you start getting these, it's called cavitation, like these little like bubbles that will start destroying the tissues. Almost imagine like bubbles in your blood or something.
Yeah.
And then come the fires, right? And so again, it's they're already kind of in a weakened state, and then those massive wildfires come through. You've probably seen the famous photos of giant sequoias with their trunks wrapped in mylar, in that shiny
Yeah.
mylar, to try to fend it off because they're incredibly fire adapted species. They really in fact they
They
need
need to be.
fire to reproduce. Yeah, they
Yeah.
need it. They love it. And yet, if the fires get too big, which they are now thanks to climate change and thanks to the fact that we've suppressed wildfire for so long,
Yes.
that there's too much material, there's too much woody debris. Native people would have burned off that material every year to try to keep the fuel low. And there are other reasons why they did it as well. We haven't been doing that. We've been doing the opposite. And so now we've got the combination of climate change and all of this fuel load is a disaster waiting to happen.
Also known as controlled burns.
Yeah. Yeah, controlled burns. Some people call it green fire, which I think is kind of beautiful.
I
It
like that.
seems to be one of the biggest. Yeah, I think indigenous-led prescribed burning is one of the most exciting new developments in the last 10 or 15 years. New, obviously, for us, not new for them.
Right. Yeah.
But it's one of the incorporating that into conservation, on a federal and state level, I think is one of the most important, one of the most exciting things that we've started to do here in Australia. You're seeing it in a variety of places. And I think that's something we need to do much more, much faster because we're going to have to adapt to this. Obviously, I'd like to see us radically lower our carbon emissions so that climate change we don't end up in a worst case scenario. But in the meantime, I mean, we're seeing it right now, right? I mean, you're probably seeing it. We're seeing the wildfire smoke every year gets worse,
Oh, yeah.
and
Yeah, a couple weeks ago, it was
it's not going to
terrible. You
change.
really
Yeah,
couldn't go outside. It was like smoking a pack of cigarettes. It was
yeah,
it was bad for a few days. And, here back east, I'm in the New York metro area. We have something called an ash blight. There's an ash borer. And so,
yeah,
I've got a pretty good sized piece of property, and we've had to take down 3 or 4 ash trees over the past couple of years because
yeah,
they were in danger of falling down. I got, and I have 2 small children. So, but it did make me reflect on trees and repurposing and of course, the indigenous and First Nations and Native American cultures and, how they've tried to repurpose animals and trees and other things. And so what we did was we brought in a portable sawmill
mm,
and took the 12-foot logs and sent them through the sawmill
yeah,
and made planks out of them.
yeah. It's
So,
great.
and that will be, I'm looking at a barn right now on my property that we are renovating. We popped out the floor, the old floor, and we use that to shore up some of the sheathing. Back then, 100 years ago, they used the same material for basically everything.
Yeah.
And we're using that as the floor. So that ash tree from 50 feet away will now be the floor,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is
it's great. I mean,
very exciting.
it's the greenest building material you can. I mean, a tree that grew, 10 feet away,
Yep.
is they're the
Locavore.
turning point. Yeah, yeah, we've
It
done the
really
same
is.
back here in the forest behind our house. We've taken, a couple of trees down and then used the Alaska mill to plane them and started building things from that local timber.
That's
It's
great.
really, not only is it obviously environmentally the right thing to do. It's also kind of rewarding, right? It feels good
Oh, very much so.
to build something from something so local. Yeah.
Yeah. And you don't have a story when you buy something from a lumber yard.
No.
You don't. You don't. It's like, "Oh, yeah, I went to my local lumber yard and they delivered it." It's
Yeah,
very different.
exactly. Yeah.
You're originally from outside of Chicago. You're now living in British Columbia. What brought you there? And, what have you noticed is the difference in forest management, forestry, just a relationship to nature and the wilderness as opposed to the United States?
Yeah. So yeah, as you say, I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. This one of those quintessential leafy little suburbs they call them, and we had a lot of trees growing up, but there was, as far as I know, no timber industry to speak of. There was originally actually there's some fascinating stories I was just reading recently about how a timber baron there on the shore of Lake Michigan, he was actually part of the Underground Railroad and would use his ships so that escaped slaves could get across, up to, I believe, going up to the UP and then going up into Canada from there. But by the time I was born, there was nothing like that. The trees were merely
Yeah.
decorative. I mean, they were something for, we loved them. They gave us shade and they were beautiful, but there was no working relationship with them. And so when you move somewhere like British Columbia, where the timber industry is a huge part of our economy, it gets a lot more complicated, right? In
Yeah.
terms of being an environmentalist, the timber wars in the Pacific Northwest and what we called the war in the woods up here often pitted working class people working in the timber industry, lumberjacks, against sort of urban environmentalists, and it became a
Yeah.
really unhealthy binary between those two, because it was, on the one hand, the people saying, look, we need jobs, this is our this is
Yeah.
our industry, and this is how we feed our families, and on the other hand, people saying, well, we don't care about that, we want to save the forest for conservation reasons, for all the
Right.
reasons that we understand. And eventually, that became to really quite acrimonious. You've probably seen, this bumper stickers that say like, kill a spotted owl, or kill an environmentalist. Save the timber industry.
Yeah.
I think that what we are trying to move towards now in British Columbia, and this is something that's still going on, because we only have somewhere between the official estimate is 8%. What people like Suzanne Simard have told me is more like 3% of our old growth forest left here in British Columbia.
Wow.
So that's
Yeah.
the 3% is sort of what they call the iconic old growth, meaning not like scrubby little trees at the top of a mountain, but the big old trees. There's only 3%
Right.
left.
Wow.
And so the question is when? When are you going to stop cutting those down, right? At what point will there be so few that we will finally stop? Because not only are they obviously, beautiful and spiritually nourishing for us, they're also really important stores of carbon.
Yeah.
As these trees, they used to say, well, you just cut them all down and then the new trees will sprout up. And that will actually lock up more carbon because they'll be growing so fast. And you'll keep cutting them down and harvesting them and locking up that carbon in boards. And it just turns out the science doesn't support that. That in fact, what half of all carbon, first of all, was stored beneath the ground. It's stored in the soil ecosystem. That's where a lot of it's
Yeah.
getting locked up. And each time you clear cut a forest, you're just completely destroying that ecosystem. You're churning it up. You're
Right.
burning a lot of it. It's slashed. All that's going into the atmosphere. And also a lot of timber turns out doesn't actually spend a long time as timber. A lot of it ends up as toilet paper or as newspaper
Right.
or
Yeah.
cardboard, whatever. And even a lot of the wood, we're look around at how we build things at IKEA. It doesn't have a long life anymore. And so that was sort of a myth that was foisted on us as a win-win solution. What we now know is that these old growth forests are very stable stores of carbon because they tend to be more fire resistant, they tend to be more drought resistant, they tend to be more pest resistant. Whereas these tree plantations, which is what we've replaced them with here in Canada, we've clear cut these diverse old forests and we've replaced them with crops of trees of a
A
couple of
monoculture.
species.
Yeah.
Monoculture, now they've mostly moved away from monospecific planting, but there'll be a couple of species that grow really fast and are
Yeah.
good, commercial value. Well, what we find now is that those trees are not resilient at all, right? They can't survive the storms, they can't survive
No.
the pests, they can't survive the fires. They are losing many trees every year, and then those are being releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere, and it's creating a feedback loop. So what's
Right.
happening in Canada right now is the forests of Canada are now a net carbon source rather than a carbon sink.
Wow.
They're releasing more carbon into the atmosphere every year than they're locking up. That's a
Wow.
terrifying thing in a
It
country,
really is.
one of the largest and most forested countries on earth,
Right.
for our trees to not be working with us, but working against us.
That's
And
scary.
it isn't, and I think in some ways it should force a almost like a spiritual realization in us that trees are not just here to protect us. They're not always going to give us what we need. If we don't respect them, they're going to punish us, right? I mean, there's this sort of very ancient kind of pagan way that we need to respect these trees, because if we don't, they're going to burn up and they're going to fill our houses with smoke and make our bodies sick in all these ways. It's really a double-edged sword. If we help them, they'll help us, and if we don't help them,
Yes.
they'll punish us.
Yeah, I mean, the Canadian boreal forest in particular has been called the lungs of the earth, and it's not even an analogy. It's just the absolute truth, and it's just scary to think that we're essentially treating our lungs of the earth like an emphysema and a smoker with emphysema.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, now they're the the smokestacks of the earth. Yeah, and
right.
that is true, by the
Yeah,
way, of the Amazon has been called the lungs of the earth as well, and that same shift is taking place in the Amazon. That same shift is taking place in the Congo basin. These trees,
yeah.
these forests are now releasing more carbon than they lock up, and that is something that we need to turn around very quickly, because, like, as I said, it's a feedback loop. It's a spiral, and so once they start releasing more carbon, climate change gets worse, and they burn, and it just goes around and around and around. So, if anything can light a fire under our asses to try to get a handle on climate change, maybe that will be it. Hopefully, it will snap us out of this mass delusion.
I'm thinking that Canada may be the one of the countries most perfectly positioned to, the tragedy of the commons, it's been called, where it's just this shared resource and nobody claims ownership and therefore it just gets overused. And, Canada had the collapse of the cod fishery back in the 1990s that really decimated, an entire industry in, the province of Newfoundland. And that was, really well chronicled in the book called Servants of the Fish. Do you think that the Canada, as a culture, as a country, has learned a lesson about that, given their failure to regulate the cod industry?
I don't think so. Not no. I mean, to a minor degree they have, but we have, I should say, but no, it's still something that, when you're trapped within this logic of profit maximization, it's really hard to throw the brakes on it. And it's really hard when people have built their livelihoods around it, I mean,
Yeah,
that in the same way that the cod fishing industry in Newfoundland was, it was not just like people, it wasn't just all greed. That was family tradition. That was
yeah,
hundreds of years of people
way of life.
doing this. Yeah, and that's all they knew. And so to suddenly say, okay, well, go get a new job, go learn to code,
Yeah,
is
yeah,
a
go
slap in the
code,
face.
right?
Yeah.
It is.
It's
Yeah,
and it's a similar thing here with the timber industry. People who do that job, it's incredibly difficult work. It's incredibly dangerous. I mean, it's one of the most
yeah,
dangerous jobs in the world. And so there's a lot of pride around that. And when you tell people that they can't do that work anymore, and not only that work is bad, right? Is environmentally kind of evil. It really hits people in an emotional place. And also as I said, it's a huge part of the economy. So it's a tough nut to crack. And I think that if you look at the work of people like Suzanne Simard, she has this project called the Mother Tree Project, where she's trying to figure out more sustainable ways to do, to do the, and also there are a lot of great indigenous led projects in the United States that are trying to find ways to cut sustainably so that you can still have jobs, you can still make money, we still have things made out of wood, which we love, right? And wood is a renewable resource. It's
yeah.
actually a great material compared to, say, concrete, which is incredibly carbon intensive.
Very much so.
People are doing really good work trying to figure out how to do it carefully, rather than in this really reckless way, which is quite outdated, but very profitable in the short term, which is just clear cut everything and then plant a bunch of fast growing, a handful of really fast growing species. That's something that we need to phase out.
And I do feel like environmentalism and conservation and protecting trees, it doesn't necessarily need to be at odds with the logging industry and with, the profession of log. We talk about 3% in Canada of old growth forests are still around. I mean, it's got to be even less than that in the United States. And, how much is it really going to affect the bottom line of an industry to have 1% that's off limits?
Yeah.
And to me, you know, that's what's been so important about protecting old growth forests is just the, you know, the sacredness, the majesty of some of these trees that have lived for thousands of years. And to say, do you really need to cut down a redwood tree that's, you know, 500, 1,000 years old?
Yeah.
You know, go knock off your matchsticks and, you know, your pine trees.
Yeah.
And, you know, we talked about a little bit about redwood summer, and you did mention Charles Hurwitz and, you know, Pacific Lumber. And, you
Yeah.
know, that wasn't a job creation mechanism. That was greed, you know, at its most cartoonish.
Yeah. Yes. That so
Can,
that is actually the most extreme case where yeah, everything I just said about how, you know, it's this it's old tradition and you know, it's a source of community stability and all of that. Hurwitz kind of set all that on fire because he took
yeah.
a really quite a good family-owned company that was cutting slowly and was planning for, you know, kind of centuries in advance and had, you know, an entire town that was kind of thriving, that was built around this industry, but it was starting to wind down. I mean, you can only cut old growth for so long. And they knew that, and they knew that sort of the clock was ticking. What Hurwitz did was came in and, you know, raided the retirement funds. He ramped up the rate of cutting. I mean, he did all the things you're not supposed to do if you want to try to do this carefully, and that's partially why things came to such a head. First with Redwood Summer, you know, Judy Berry and Daryl Cherney and Earth First, and then later with Julia Butterfly, was because you had such a just cartoonishly villainous embodiment of everything that's wrong with capitalism in
Yeah.
Charles Hurwitz. And so the you know, I think the basic problem that we are running into is that old trees are worth a lot of money. You know, that this is
Mm,
why Canada finds it so hard to wean itself off of this industry, is that an ancient tree has really, really valuable timber because it is so large, the growth rings are so tight, the younger trees just aren't worth as much. And so even though there's only
yeah.
3% left, that 3% is gold, you know, for
I
people who
see.
want to cut it down. And
Yeah.
so there will the easy win-win solution is going to be really hard to come by. We're going to have to make a choice. And the choice is, are we going to allow these last, you know, beautiful old forests to stand, or are we going to convert them into timber and then never, you know, they'll never come back. I mean, they will get transformed into plantations and those ecosystems, certainly not in our lifetimes or anyone we will ever know's lifetime, will never come back because it has taken so long for them to develop in the first place. I mean, really, it takes millennia for a forest like that to develop.
I mean, and, you know, I would say Redwood Summer was a success in many respects. I mean, there's the Headwaters National Forest in
Yeah.
Humboldt County that's protected a large swath of redwoods there. And, you know, for anybody that's ever traveled throughout the United States, Humboldt County in Northern California is one of the nicest places on earth. Of
Yeah.
course, it's known for a different kind of tree to most people,
Yeah.
but but the redwood trees are, to me, are the most famous and the most majestic. And I mean, it's just an amazing part of the world.
If people
And
want a really good book about, well, there's been a lot written about specifically the Headwaters Forest, but about the, you know, redwood logging in general. There was a book that came out a couple years ago called The Ghost Forest by Greg King. If you've ever
okay,
read that one, but it is
no,
an
I've not.
incredible work. He was one of the early Earth Firsters, along with, he was actually working right alongside Judy Berry and Daryl Cherney, and he, you know, it describes not only that fight being, you know, hanging off of bridges and climbing trees and doing, you know, all these things to try to monkey wrench the timber industry, but also he describes the long history of conservation in the state and all of the complicated ways that redwoods were involved in, you know, for example, the growth of the oil industry. They used to be used for oil pipelines. They were used, it was really
Wow.
the backbone of industrialism for a long time in the state. And also there's all these complicated racial things going on where redwoods were perceived as a symbol of the noble but endangered white race. You know, so all of these eugenicists loved redwoods. I mean, it is such a rich topic and such a complicated topic, and he plumbs it all beautifully. I think it should have won, you know, Pulitzer Prize or something. It's just an incredible book.
Yeah, and I was in that area of the world. I think it was the year after Redwood Summer, maybe 1999, and I was an intern with Earth First, and I helped produce
Mm,
their publication, their first journal. Spent some time in, some tree sits myself. Interestingly enough, as I'm redoing my barn here, the number one building product probably in the United States is Douglas fir. It's what all our
Mhm.
two by fours are made out of. And, we were in a 500-year-old Douglas fir tree. And, the idea is not to cut down something that majestic so it can become two by fours. And Umpqua National Forest, just outside of Roseburg, Oregon, off the
Mm.
I-5 for anybody that knows that area. But there was that common villain in Charles Hurwitz, and I do feel like there was that, the tension between the interlopers, the outsiders, the white collar, trustafarians versus,
Yeah.
the blue collar loggers who had lived in that area, Eureka, California, for generations, and
Yeah.
if I feel like had that relationship been better, it could have been more successful. And I'm wondering how you feel that is today and some of your experiences that you detailed in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that we can find ways to break apart that binary. This is something that in the book in general, I think that when I talk about arborescence, it's a non-binary, it's branchy. And so it's like many things can be true at once, and many different
Yeah.
groups can have a shared allegiance. Many branches can have one trunk. And so I hope that we can find a way to bring together the loggers and the environmental movement in a common cause. And one of the interesting ways that is happening is, in Indigenous First Nations people. It's a really complicated topic here in Canada because First Nations people have suffered so much throughout the years, and now when there's so little old growth left, now finally they're being cut in on these deals to say, well, if you clear cut your old growth forest, then we'll cut you in. And so in some cases that's being done kind of recklessly, and in some cases it's being done very carefully and being done according to indigenous values. And so I think that might be sort of all of us looking to those indigenous values and trying to learn from First Nations people about, is there a way to do this that breaks out of this old, as I trace in the book, very, very old binary between, wilderness or pure nature and the sort of despoiled world where human beings live over here, where everything's pure and natural over there, and everything over here is ruined. And so who cares what happens over here? And I think that indigenous people have always lived in a much more entangled way, and
Yeah.
I've never found an indigenous culture that has a word for wilderness. Because it was just where they lived, and they were living in it in these profound webs of what they call relationality. That it was about maintaining those threads of relationality was the primary spiritual work. And the beautiful thing about that is that it benefits you. If you benefit it, it benefits you. I mean, this is a point that Wendell Berry makes as well, is that the environmental movement is kind of unusual in that a lot of social movements, it's about helping someone else. So if you're thinking about
Yeah.
civil rights, you're a white person, you're like, well, I'd like to help, black people get the right to vote. The environmental movement, not only are we all a part of it because when we are living, the way that we live damages the environment, we all also benefit from it when suddenly
Yeah.
the air gets cleaner and the water gets cleaner.
Water is
So
cleaner.
it
Yes.
isn't completely an entangled movement that everyone, there's no outside, everyone is in it, whether they like it or not. And so I think that this is what I'm trying to get to with this book is a broader environmental philosophy that moves beyond those old binaries and is a
Yes.
little bit more relational. It's a tough thing to talk about in a podcast. It's really, really complicated and really deep.
Yes. Yeah.
So, you gotta dig back through a lot of different history to make it make sense. But I think that we are on the cusp of it. I think that the next step in environmental philosophy is here, and it's being led primarily by indigenous people.
Yeah. I mean, I look back on the environmental movement from, the 1970s, and I do feel like it has lost its way in certain respects in that it's become bifurcated and, these terms like climate justice are thrown about, which, to certain segments of the population that's a turnoff, those
Mm,
sort of terminology. But what's not a turnoff is clean water and clean air.
yeah,
And, in 1970, in, the creation of the modern environmental movement, when the Natural Resources Defense Council was founded, I worked for NRDC for almost a decade,
yeah,
that the EPA was created, the Clean Water Act was signed, the Clean Air Act was signed by Nixon.
Yeah.
And, you had the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland literally catching on fire, one of the,
Yeah.
the strangest videos I've ever watched in my life. And nobody can say, I don't want clean water. I don't want clean air. But, you couch it in terms like climate justice, and that can turn some people off. So I do feel like, maybe we just need to get back to a place that we were even 50 years ago.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the right has intuited that. I mean, Trump, will often say like we're going to have crystal clear, sparkling water and beautiful, clean air. He understood that is the primary thing that people care about is the
Yeah.
existential thing. It is the air and the water. Meanwhile, he is like dismantling the Clean Air and Clean Water Act and, ensuring that our air and water are dirtier than they've been in generations. But he understands the messaging in a very concrete way. I think that the the trouble with climate change is that it's so large and it's so terrifying on the long scale, right? So it sort of blows our circuits in one sense
It does.
because it is so
Yeah.
big. It's sort of what Timothy Morton calls a hyper object. It's like you can't get your hands around it. But on the other hand, it's not immediately pressing enough to light a
Yeah.
fire under us because maybe it'll be our kids or our grandkids or our great grandkids that will suffer from it. And this is one of the things I've been thinking about is how we connect ourselves back to the future, caring about the future, what I call the ecology of time, being entangled in the ecology of time.
Right.
Because look, I'm a gay guy, got no kids. Like by all rights, I shouldn't care what happens in the future, right? I don't have kids and grandkids, which is how this is
Right.
often framed, to worry about. So when I die, I could just live it up. And when I die, well, who cares? I think that's a really damaging headspace to be in, a really kind of poisonous headspace. And yet it's
It
really
is.
alluring because we don't have right now the right rhetoric, the right frame of mind to make sense of why we should care about the future. But the amazing thing is if you stand in front of a tree, suddenly all that goes away, right? So it's really hard
Yeah.
to care about what happens 500 years in the future. But if you stand in front of a tree that's 500 years old and it could live for another 500 years, suddenly it's not intellectual anymore. It's pre-intellectual. It's intuitive. It's visceral. You care. You do
It is.
care if that tree gets cut down, right? You do care if these beautiful places go away. Beauty is sort of one of the things that entangles us into these landscapes. And also, there's just something really ancient. I mean, we spent our evolutionary history living in the branches of trees. Trees held us in their hands every night while we slept for millions of years. I think that's something
Yeah.
very, very deep in us that we don't often recognize is that we do care, even if we can blind ourselves and we can become lost in these worlds, these online worlds and these worlds of capitalism where there's all these perverse incentives. You just go for a walk in the woods for 10 minutes and suddenly you snap out of it and you
Yeah.
remember what's real and what we should really care about.
I mean, there's so many ridiculous Gen Z expressions, but one of my favorites, and it's so apt, is touch grass.
Touch grass,
Which-
touch trees.
touch trees. I mean, it is
Yeah.
so important. And
Yeah, that's
I mean,
actually
I
what
never.
that's what bonsai
Go ahead.
artists call it. They call it touching trees. So, every day you got to touch trees, and yeah, I think it's true. Touch grass, touch trees, do it.
So, talking about having, in ancient times lived in trees, you did get a chance to see that, ancient times, still to a certain extent around today with the Hawaii people. Am I pronouncing that properly?
Korowai,
In
yeah,
Indonesia?
Korowai.
Kurawai in Papua New Guinea?
Yeah, well, in West Papua, it's the other side of the
West Papua. Okay.
the Indonesian Papua. Yeah,
And can you talk a little bit about that and your
yeah.
experience with those folks?
Yeah, I mean that's a fascinating example because the Korowai, some of your listeners may have seen them in documentaries. They live in these tree houses, these really and stunning tree houses, at least according to these documentaries. But what I found when I arrived there was actually our picture of them is a little bit off because they do live in tree houses, but the tree houses don't look the way we want them to. The tree houses they live in tend to be kind of on top of maybe 8 or 10 trees that have been sawn off, so they're like stilts, and they're like maybe 30 feet off the ground. But because of our cultural associations with childhood and all these Tarzan and sort of narratives like that, we want them to live in really tall tree houses at the tops of trees. Like that's what looks better for photos. And there were a couple of Korowai people who lived like that. And there was actually like one in particular that became very famous because he was photographed by a National Geographic photographer, George Steinmetz, and it became part of this big story, which then sort of percolated out into the public, and tourists started showing up there saying, well, where are the tree houses like that? And so the Korowai started building tree houses like that for us to meet our expectations. And so, these are still people who are, they're being lured into town life now, but they're still living this sort of hybrid life as hunter gatherer people. They have incredible skills, incredible what we used to call woodcraft skills. I watched a guy named Marcus climb a tree. He was probably in his 50s, and I've never seen someone climb a tree with so much grace. So much.
Yeah.
It was just a beautiful thing to watch. He climbed up this vine, and he was using his toes to kind of clamp around the vine, almost like you'd grab a cigar. And he climbed maybe 30 or 40 feet up this vine, and then he swung into the branches of another tree, and he stood there in the branches, and it was just like, so at ease. And it's because he'd been doing it his whole life. He never stopped climbing trees. So there's some sense in which what you're seeing when you're there is an illusion, because they are building these tree houses for us. They're doing a lot of these activities for tourists to sort of show off for us, and
Right.
and we're paying them to see it. There's not many tourists who come every year, but it's enough to
Right.
where some of these guys are making a living at it. But on the other hand, it's real. It is very real. They still have those skills, and so they're living a very complicated hybrid life between the ancient and the sort of modern capitalist life. And I find that fascinating. I love those kinds of contradictions and complexities.
I mean, it almost speaks to the story of, mankind and civilization, and how, even to this day, of most particularly in China, where people are moving from rural areas to cities, and with that comes all of the trappings of, the video game systems and air conditioning and TVs, and it's you can't fault people for wanting a better life. And in some respects, I think you wrote about it in the book, that there is this sort of sense of, I don't know, nostalgia, that it must be better living in more primitive ways, or closer to nature. But folks
Yeah.
that do live that way want the reverse, and maybe want to come to the more cityfied world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is, I've visited a lot of indigenous people around the world living, as we'd say, sort of close to nature, and the siren call of modernity is incredibly strong for them, right? Because it's
Yeah.
just so convenient. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just incredibly convenient to have, a zinc roofed hut, for example, rather than a thatched roof hut, because you don't have to keep replacing the thatch. It's incredibly
Yeah.
useful to have a plastic cigarette lighter. Like, that is a miracle. A plastic bucket. People often tell me a plastic bucket is one of the most amazing inventions in mankind, and we just completely take it for granted. We don't even think
Wow.
about it. And I think that is something that people we can't deny that. Anyone I've ever met who's tried to go back to a very primitive form of life, I mean, quote unquote primitive, but shunning all of modern technology, they you can't last very long, especially without a community. I mean, the
Yeah.
thing to keep in mind about these hunter-gatherer societies, and this is sort of like the strange fantasy that a lot of us have, is, oh, we'll just go back. We'll just go back and go live in the forest with nothing, and we'd be fine.
Right.
Sort of Tarzan fantasy. Well, those communities that are doing that have been doing so for countless generations. And so there's this body of knowledge and this body of skills that has been building, and this communal support. And it's especially true among the Korowai. I mean, they have an incredibly egalitarian society. So they share everything. There's almost no hierarchy. And what you often find in those hunter-gatherer societies is they'll say, there's this famous example where this anthropologist asked him, well, where do you store your food? If there's a lean year, if there's a famine, where do you store your food? And he said, well, I store my food in my neighbor's belly. What he means is I share with him, and then when I need it, he'll share with me. And so those networks of communal support, all of that ancestral knowledge, is what allows them to live on land as they do. We can't
Yeah.
just suddenly, snap our fingers. I mean, this is a kind of a fantasy about climate change as well. Maybe everything will collapse and we'll go back to nature. I
Right.
think that's a ridiculous narrative. I think we would be it would be horrific. But what I'm also trying to do is, again, in this arborescent way, this branchy way, to look at, it's not like there's one arc for humankind that goes from, the Stone Age up to modern technology. They're branching. It's everyone's following these branching pathways. And so the Korowai are navigating their own form of modernity. They call it multiple modernities. They have their own distinct form of modernity, which is adapting some of the technology and rejecting some of it, and adopting some of these foreign ideas that are coming in from the missionaries and from elsewhere, and they're rejecting some of it. And we're all doing that in various ways. And so I don't think we should become too reductive about it. There are ways to exist within modernity that will continue to maintain some of those ancient traditions and living close to the land. I think we could grow towards that as well, rather than just throwing our hands up and going, well, it's inevitable. Everyone's going to eventually become part of global capitalism and just consume everything until it's all gone.
Right. You had a really great quote in the book. In order to grow up, one must first grow down. What do you
Mm.
mean by that?
Yeah, so that was the last big realization I had reading and writing this book was about rootedness. That I think there is a deep need in us to be rooted to local ecologies and local communities in a way that we've lost. I mean, and I trace the history of how we've lost it. It's an incredibly long history, but it's an organic thing. It's not a binary. Again, it didn't just happen one day like a light switch turning on. It's sort of been happening continually for thousands of years in the West. And now I think we've reached the point where our lack of roots is so profound we don't even know we're missing it anymore. Most of
Yeah.
us. I mean, some people do. Some people still crave it, and you'll see a little people trying to revive that rhetoric, often in really dangerous, I think, and unhelpful ways of rootedness. In the sort of ethno nationalist way, which is, in my opinion, a kind of sham rootedness. But the
Yeah.
rootedness that indigenous people describe to me is, there's this Cherokee philosopher named Brian Burkhart who says that really the heart of indigeneity is being in kinship and being in the land. So being in kinship is seeing how we're all related and we sort of owe things to one another in a reciprocal way as you would in your family. And then being in the land is being so tethered to land that it actually sort of grows up through you. So your language, your mythology, your beliefs are coming from the local landscape. They're not coming from elsewhere. They're not sort of he talks about colonial culture sort of floating free from the land. If you think about where our ideas, our philosophies, our language, our mythology, where does it come from? It's not from right here. It's not from right here where I live. It's not from right there where you live. It's from elsewhere. And so that sense of rootedness is a very, very deep and complicated spiritual and philosophical concept that is really alien, at least to me. I grew up in Illinois. My parents are from Texas. I live in Canada now. Neither of my parents live in Illinois. My sisters don't live in
Wow.
Illinois. We just move
Right.
all over. And I didn't think it was weird, to not have
Yeah.
any ties. And now I do. I think that that's actually a profound lack in us. And we need to start learning to set down those roots again. And yet again, this is something that we can try to learn from indigenous peoples, that they have a lot to teach us when it comes to the concept of true rootedness.
You talked about the contrast between indigenous folks and some of the tree sitters, and there was almost like a sense of cosplaying where they would sprinkle
Mm,
tobacco on the base of the tree before cutting it down.
yeah.
What's your take on that? And is it
Yeah.
is it being respectful? Is it overdoing it? Is it
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's, yeah, the cultural appropriation was a hot topic last 10 years or so. And I think that is one where I don't think, I think they're well intended. I think the people who are doing that, who are sort of appropriating those native traditions, I think their heart is in the right place. They're just doing it in a sort of shallow way. And
right?
it's the shallowness that offends indigenous people who see that tradition being used like that, especially if it's being used in a sort of egotistical way. Like, look at me, I'm so special. I'm performing this native ritual, and therefore I'm a deep person. And if you're doing that in a shallow way, that I could see that being very infuriating, especially when you are the people who stole the land, right? And so there's a First Nations woman named Grandma Losa who told me, they want to have what we have, but what we have is what they tried to kill. Meaning this deep sense of rootedness and indigeneity. And so that's a really tricky one to navigate, because I think most indigenous people would agree that having no roots at all, living in an unrooted way, where you feel free to just sort of sweep across the land like locusts and use up all the resources, which is exactly what you see when you look at the colonial history of North America.
Yeah.
People just using a piece of land up until it's essentially exhausted, and moving to the next one, and moving on and on and on,
Yeah.
and then finding more and more resources to extract. That's obviously bad. That is obviously something we need to get away from. But trying to then become rooted on land that is, like here in British Columbia, unceded native land, unceded First Nations territory is also a tricky thing. And so this is something where we're going to have some really tough conversations and really learn to listen to Indigenous people. Thankfully, a lot of them are very generous with their wisdom, and they're very generous, with their teachings. And so as long as you do it and you're not being egotistical, you're being, respectful, I think most of the First Nations people I've met are actually appreciative of people, settlers listening and trying to learn. Yeah, but we got to tread carefully.
Yeah. I've had this conversation before with Native American authors that land acknowledgments are not going to change anything.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that shallowness, it again, it's sort of like, I don't know. There's a way to look at it, and that's a binary that says it's not, it's bad. I think it's more like it's not enough. I think like land acknowledgments, a lot of those surface level, if it's easy, then it's probably
not
not.
worth
It's
it.
probably not enough. And ultimately,
Yeah.
this is the big movement here in Canada, is the land back movement. I'm sure it's in many parts of North America. I mean, in the United States, it's a central topic of Native American organizing as well. Is like, it has to do with land. We need this land back, but also there's a cultural component, which is they're the victims of cultural genocide, and so if what we're doing is we're returning land to Native people, and yet all of their traditions have been hollowed out by colonialism, and capitalism is constantly pressuring them to exploit those lands. What you're going to see is people rising to the fore who are serving the interest of capitalism. And so you're going to see people who are willing to exploit that land from within Indigenous communities. I mean, the industry is constantly seeking that. They're always looking for people who can serve as a native figurehead for capitalist industrialist interests. I mean, you see it here in Canada constantly. And so again, it's a really complex topic. It has to be, land back and culture back, and all of it, that cultural regeneration all has to happen simultaneously so that the native communities can thrive on that land and not have that land be exploited for short-term gains by, people who are going to take that money and, build the industry and then cut and run once there's no more old trees left to build, or whatever it is, whatever, resource they're looking to exploit. So yeah, that's a complicated issue as well.
Yeah, it sure is. You mentioned in the book that you want to be laid to rest in a forest. Is that still something you've contemplated doing? Hopefully
Yeah,
many years from now?
yeah, hopefully. I think that, yeah, I do. I mean, I think that the way that we currently bury bodies, most people in what are called lawn cemeteries,
Right.
is grotesque, to be honest. To put a person under this bright green fertilized grass inside of a casket that's all sealed up, trying to fool yourself into thinking you're not going to decompose, is just absolutely ridiculous.
Strange.
And it doesn't do that much good for the world, right? I think ideally we'd want to give something back when we pass on, and that's the beauty of being buried in a forest, is that you're returning your body to the soil, so you're helping feed the soil, and also you're helping to protect that forest, because now your family is not going to want to see that forest get cut down if they know you're
Mm,
laid to rest there.
very
It's
important.
going to sort of
Yeah.
help preserve it in its wild state. And so I think that the forest cemetery movement is one of the most exciting and just like obvious, intuitive things that we should be doing. I at one point I ran the math, and I believe that if we'd been burying bodies in the United States in forests instead of in cemeteries, lawn cemeteries, we would have enough land, something like the equivalent of Yosemite National Park would be preserved currently. And of course, every year more people are dying, so more land could
Yeah.
conceivably be conserved. It's just an idea whose time has come.
Yeah. Well, and with the aging baby boomer population, we don't have that land like we once did, where people could be buried and laid out in a one story stretch of grass. So there's got to
Yeah,
be another way.
yeah, yeah. I do agree.
Any final thoughts, Robert, on all of these travels and all this time you spent in trees, surrounding trees, with people who work on trees and live in trees?
I mean, I think I don't know. There's so many thoughts, but the one sort of takeaway people could have is just to spend more time around trees so that you can arborize your thinking. I think that when you study the people I call arborescent thinkers, it's remarkable how often they spent time in forests. And
Yeah.
and especially, I think, if you can, go climb a tree. Because what you'll find is that your phenomenology, what philosophers call phenomenology, your sort of moment to moment experience of reality will change profoundly out there. And what you'll find is that you'll feel very precarious, but you'll feel very grateful. When you're in the branches of a tree, suddenly you realize that that tree is holding you. And I think that that is a state of mind that we should try to extend to ecology in general, to understand that this planet is a living thing who has our lives in its hands. And a lot of what we are currently doing environmentally is like sawing away at the branch that is holding our lives so that we can sell the wood. For,
Yeah.
it's a ridiculous thing to do. We know it and we
Yeah.
know it is. And yet we're sort of trapped in
Yeah.
these systems. So when you're trying to take away a lesson, it's first of all, spend more time around trees and then try to change those systems so that we can live
Yeah.
more arborescently, so we can live with deeper roots, but also be, creative and rigorous and all of those beautiful things. I think there's so much for us to learn out in the forest. We just got to go out there and keep our eyes open.
I love it. Well said. You've written on trails, in trees, and exploration. What's next for you?
Well, so this is part of a trilogy, I think. So the third one, I believe, will
Great.
be called Of Stars. And it will
Nice.
be about the cosmos. It will be about dark spaces, sort of the deep sea, the abyssal zone of the sea, the poles in winter. I'm not totally sure, but I think that's going to be the theme. The first book took me 7 years to write. This one took me 9
Wow.
years.
Wow.
So these are big projects. They take a lot of
Yeah.
time for me. I'm a little wary to jump right into another one. I might write a different book first because it takes a
Yeah.
lot of work to finish these books.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to have you on the show in less than 9 years. So
Let's hope. Let's hope.
Well, Robert, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for being on.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's a great conversation.
All Across America is produced by me, Marco Vig, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Visit us on Instagram at All Across America. Check out our website, allacrossamerica.com. There's an interactive map with all our episodes, and there's a Contact Us page where you can send your reactions, guest ideas, and suggestions. So get in touch, stay connected. To me, that's what podcasting is all about. Thanks for listening.